This is the SilverStone Kublai KL07, which is the company's best attempt at a discrete, silent-focused PC that still retains some cooling ability by way of 3 installed 140mm fans and ventilation in the top and front panels. Today we're reviewing this case and testing it versus other cases in the market like the Fractal Define C, the Be Quiet, Pure Base 600, and the entire rest of the case testing suite that we've done in the last few months. Before getting to those, this coverage is brought to you by EVGA and their 1080 Ti SC2, which we've recommended fairly highly for its build quality and the ICX sensors, which are kind of fun to play with. You can check our full SC2 review for the 1080 Ti if you're curious to learn more, or you can click the link in the description below to find the product page for the 1080 Ti SC2. So starting with the basics for the case before getting into the thermal and noise testing and the build process and ease of installation, it's a mid-tower, supports ATX motherboards, standard ATX power supplies, and has a power supply shroud, as is the trend now. Also, as is the trend, this is a SilverStone case that has moved away from the ventilation like you see on the RL06, and instead it goes with a more sleek design, which is, again, a bit of a trend ever since the S340 by NZXT. So that's the design for the case. It's got some ventilation in the top and in the front side, which helps out a lot with the breathability, as we'll see in testing. Includes 2 140mm fans in the front pre-installed, and they are installed on a cage that's easily removable, so you can more readily access the fans. This also means that you're only dealing with 2 screws rather than 8 for the fans, and they're a lot easier to access. Not the first time we've seen something like that, but it's always good to see a focus on these function features in a case like an $85 unit from SilverStone. As for the hard drive cage, also another function feature, the cage can be relocated to one of 2 or 3 different positions so that you can push it away or pull it in towards the power supply. That way, if it's a longer PSU, you get more room for the cabling. Otherwise, you get some clearance to the front end for another fan or a larger radiator. The KL07 follows the current trend of smooth blank exterior surfaces, with the exception of some fractal-esque side ventilation and decorative grooves wandering across the front and top panels. Power and reset buttons are hidden within these grooves, leaving a seamless surface except for the I/O panel, including USB Type-C, and a nearly invisible SilverStone logo at the bottom. SilverStone has experimented with flashy plastic panels on cases like the Primera 01, but there's none of that here, and neither is there a side window. Windows are a compromise on cases that claim to be noise damping, and the target audience likely won't miss it anyway. The interior is plain, but easy enough to build in. This is a similar layout to the RL06, with a few optional adds to improve ease of installation. 3 toolless SSD bays behind the motherboard are cleverly made, if sometimes finicky. There's only one possible orientation for the drives, the SATA and power facing the right side towards the rear of the case. The bays are attached to the chassis by hinges which allow them to swing out and accept the 2.5-inch drive. This may not add much in the way of functionality, but it feels efficient and eliminates more screws, which means that it's quicker to install the system. These are also well placed for cable management, something that SilverStone has needed to work on for a while now, and they're getting better, though Fractal does still beat them out in terms of best cable management, along with NZXT and the S340 series. Still, no messing about with screws with these, and the toolless bays offer a bit more clearance for heat dissipation anyway. Unfortunately, the middle bay is prevented from fully swinging out by a rubber grommet underneath, which is a bit of an oversight by SilverStone, and possibly the one up top as well if cables were routed over it. So we're going to get into testing straight away here, starting with noise and then thermals. As always, the link in the description below contains full testing methodology alongside Patrick Lathan's written review on the website if you prefer the written format. He also goes into more depth on the build process and cable management if those aspects are more important to you. Starting out with noise testing this time, seeing as SilverStone's 10mm thick foam padding is the centerpiece of the case's marketing, SilverStone uses foam that's more similar to Studio Pyramid foam, rising higher than most other cases on the market while still retaining the dimples in the material. This theoretically helps break up the sound wave as it collides with the foam, primarily useful for minimizing high-frequency noise. Low-frequency noise will have an easier time escaping the enclosure, but the only effective way to stop that is with thick case materials, like 2 to 3mm thick aluminum as used in some Inwin or Lian Li enclosures, but this is obviously very expensive. This helps deaden lower frequencies the best. Still, SilverStone's approach is to deaden high frequencies, and that's a noble one, seen as coil whine, fan whine, and pump whine all tend to be in the higher frequency spectrum. Anyway, we're not yet testing frequencies, but with simpler dBA testing, we're seeing the SilverStone KL07 operate at around 34.2 dBA when the cases included 3 140mm fans are maxed to 950 RPM, making it effectively identical in performance to the S340 Elite at 1050 RPM, the Fractal Define C, which is at 34.8 dBA, and the Be Quiet Pure Bass 600 with its top open and fans maxed running 34.2 dBA. The Fractal Define C technically places below the others on the chart, partly due to its higher RPM and unmuffled side window, but it's effectively the same volume to the human ear. With low RPM 140mm fans and near total foam coverage on the KL07, SilverStone's case is on the low end of our noise chart in a good way and compares respectively to other noise damping cases that we've reviewed. As we showed in the Be Quiet Pure Bass 600 review, noise insulation and absorption also risks heat insulation, as flat paneling with foam makes it more difficult for the heat to escape the case. There's no ventilation then. The SilverStone KL07's 10mm thick foam blocks are larger than most other cases and what they house, but the others often rely on rubberized foam and so eat into the airflow space more. Starting with our torture test to burn both the CPU and GPU with power viruses, the KL07 CPU operates at a steady state average of 56.3 Celsius delta T over ambient, which ranks it effectively tied with the Coleman and a bit cooler than the S340 Elite at 1050 RPM. The CPU didn't overheat or experience throttling, but the KL07 does have the unfortunate burden of being compared to SilverStone's typically well-ventilated cases. It doesn't even come close to the RL06's impressively low 47.8 Celsius CPU DT under load. Compared to the Fractal Define C, the KL07 operates about the same, 56.3 versus 55.8 Celsius delta T, which is within our 0.5 Celsius plus or minus window of variance. For GPU temperatures and the torture workload, the KL07 benefits from an intake-heavy design that funnels air into our dual axial gaming X1080, with the GPU DT reporting at 51.1 Celsius under load, or about equal to an RL06 with similar fan RPMs. The 570X, 270R, and Coleman are also nearby. Compared to other silent focused cases like the Fractal Define C at 57.4 Celsius delta T or the Be Quiet Pure Bass 600 at 57.4 Celsius DT, the SilverStone KL07 does well here. Blender rendering is next and gives us a real-world look at performance. Starting with the CPU render, the KL07 operates a CPU temperature of 38.9 Celsius delta T over ambient when rendering, with the GPU warming up to 6.9 Celsius as it is hit by exhausted heat from the CPU. We only just started these tests, so I don't have a ton of data on here yet. Compared to the RL06, we see an increase in thermals of about 4C, which isn't terrible given the silent focus of the KL07. Looking next at GPU rendering temperatures, the KL07 keeps the video card to 27.5 Celsius delta T, which is 10C cooler than the entry-level Spec 04, a case that throttled us in some tests, and a bit warmer again than the RL06. 3D Mark Firestrike Extreme looping for half an hour gives us a gaming workload where both the CPU and GPU work to heat up the box in a realistic fashion. The CPU ends up at 30.8 Celsius delta T over ambient, comparable to the OpenAir Core P3, with the GPU at 55.3 Celsius delta T compared to the 54.5 Celsius in the OpenAir case. This isn't into throttle territory yet, but it's not too terribly far. The Spec 04 was throttling for perspective, so you'd want to ramp up the GPU fan speed a bit to better deal with this scenario. The SilverStone Kublai 07, this case, does not appeal to any one specific market. A lot of cases like the Redline 06 appeal to a specific market. So the Redline was good for a performance-oriented user who wants the high focused airflow in the front panel where you get pretty low and controllable thermals. For something more silent driven, really almost anything from Be Quiet would fit that bill, and not necessarily any good in the cooling department, but they do target silence and then you're kind of left to your own devices to sort out the cooling. This case does both decently, but neither silence nor cooling performance the best. So it is a middle ground, jack of all trades for silence and performance. And if you want a little bit of each, it's not a bad case to look at for $85. That's the big thing. At the price point, $85, it's quite a reasonable buy. And this is something where, as we do more and more of these case reviews this year, it seems like it's becoming a trend to see that the cases right now that we're reviewing are actually pretty reasonably priced, which isn't something that can be said for a lot of other aspects and components in the industry. So cases, at least, have got their heads on straight and keep things level. But at $85, you should not buy this for a performance-oriented build. And if you want silence it's really not bad. It does compete directly with the Fractal Define C and the Be Quiet Pure Base 600, but the thing with those is the Define C excels in cable management in a few more ways than this does. So Define C, if you're most focused on silence and cable management, is the better choice. But if you want some of the cooling performance from something like the Redline series, this would be a good half step and would be the one that we would recommend. But again, Fractal does have better cable management and a bit better noise isolation in some scenarios. It really just kind of depends on what kind of hardware you have in there, because ultimately case reviews are the least scientific of all reviews, no matter how much we work to control them, because when you change the components of the build, really everything else can change. So it all does depend on what you build with. But if your build is similar to ours, then this data should help you make a choice, especially if you're using a dual axial fan, which, let's be honest, is one of the most common setups anyway. So that's it for this one. If you are interested to learn more about this case, click the link below for the review. We also have a link to the product, the KL07, and some competing products in the description. And as always, subscribe for more. Patreon.com/GamersNexus helps out directly. Store.gamersnexus.net for shirts. Thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.